Hi everyone, welcome to tonight's Orbit Live event. We're thrilled to be bringing together debut authors Vaishnavi Patel and Chelsea Abdullah for this event. Vaishnavi is the author of the New York Times bestselling Kaikeyi, which came out from Red Hook in April, and Chelsea is the author of The Stardust Thief, which is out from Orbit this week. Both novels are inspired by oral storytelling traditions, and that's the theme of tonight's event. Later on, Vaishnavi and Chelsea will also be answering your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen and enter your question there. You can also vote on other attendees' questions so that we know which are the most popular and can answer those first. If you'd like to buy a copy of Kaikeyi or The Stardust Thief, click on the green button at the bottom of the screen that says Buy Vaishnavi and Chelsea's books. And if you'd like to be notified about upcoming Orbit Live events, follow us on Crowdcast by clicking where it says Orbit Live at the top of your screen and then clicking the green follow button. Now it is my pleasure to turn things over to Vaishnavi Patel and Chelsea Abdullah.
Hi, it's so great to be here with you tonight. So I figured I would kick things off by starting at the very beginning with both The Stardust Thief, and I'll come back around for Kaikeyi. But Chelsea, when we talk about oral storytelling, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is my grandma telling me stories when I was a young kid. And I'm wondering, was The Stardust Thief influenced by that kind of oral storytelling, stories you heard as a kid? Are there any favorite stories that made it in?
Yeah. So for me, and I'm sure, I talk about this all the time, but The Stardust Thief is entirely a nostalgic project for me. And so, I originally came up with the concept when I first left home, when I first left Kuwait, and, was thinking about those old oral stories that my dad had told me. And, some of those oral stories were from the 1001 Nights collection, but then some of them were also tales from around the region as well. And my family is originally based in this small island off the coast of Kuwait called Failaka. And my dad used to tell me a lot about, island life there and sort of like the island myths, the jinn stories and stuff that he grew up with. And so a lot of those stories were kind of the backbone of The Stardust Thief. Those were the stories that I thought about when I, left Kuwait. And that is where I'd say The Stardust Thief started. In terms of a favorite story, I have to say Alibaba and the 40 Thieves.
I mean, that one's definitely front and center in Stardust Thief.
It is, absolutely. Even though the way it's been used, I think, is very different.
Quite different.
I remember as a kid when my dad first told me that story, I was just kind of shaking my head the whole way through, like, why are the characters doing what they're doing? Like, why is he breaking into this cave? Well, it just, it was magical. And as a child, I thought the whole thing was, conceptually, it was so cool. But, I had this little voice in the back of my head saying, but why? And then there is a servant in that story, a female servant, who basically saves the day and kind of like, kills all of the thieves in that story. And that stuck with me as a child. I was like, wow, that's really badass.
Yeah.
And for some reason that throughout the years has stuck with me. May or may not have influenced one of the female thieves in The Stardust Thief. So I'd say
as
that
soon
one
as
is...
you said that, I was like, Aisha? Is it
yes,
you?
There's very much a cutthroat thief in The Stardust Thief who is all about stabbing first and asking questions never. But I love her dearly.
I love that.
Yeah, so that's sort of the inspiration behind The Stardust Thief. But you were talking about the inspiration, from your grandmother's tales and her telling you oral stories. So what does that look like on your end? What was the spark behind your novel?
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in the US, and every summer my grandma would come from India to stay with us for usually like 4 or 5 months. And so for that period, every day at lunch, we would get a different story from a different Indian myth. And so we got stories from, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which are the two sort of big Indian epics. We also got sort of regional tales like you were talking about, specific to Marathi people. We got other just like Hindu myth stories. But similar to how you said that, like, the character of the servant got stuck in your head. When I was hearing the story of the Ramayana, the character of Kaikeyi got stuck in my head. So in the Ramayana, Kaikeyi is this evil stepmother character who banishes her son Ram so that her biological son can take the throne. And I remember when my grandma told me about this, my mom sort of cut in and she was like, actually, Kaikeyi isn't that evil, because without her exiling Ram, you don't get the rest of the Ramayana, you don't get the world getting cleansed of evil. Like, her actions were actually extremely important. And I think, that stuck in my head as a character study of Kaikeyi, but it also, for me, is part of the reason why I love oral storytelling so much. It's that it's not static. If you read a book and you reread a favorite book, it's going to be exactly the same. Maybe you'll get something new from the pages, you'll get something new from what the characters are saying, but the characters are saying the same thing every time. And when you hear an oral story, the story changes a little bit every time. We used to ask my grandma to repeat stories, and every time, invariably, there'd be a slight change or a new detail, and we would always call her out on it, which in hindsight was like pretty mean of us. But people can also object and debate with the story itself in the middle of the story. And I think that's, part of the magic for it, for me. And so
it's very interactive.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I'm halfway through The Stardust Thief, and one of the features that I really love is how there's these interstitial stories. So if you haven't picked up The Stardust Thief, this is not a spoiler because it starts with one. But it starts with it has interspersed these sort of set apart tales that are stories specific to the world, that are adding to the world. Often, I think they're going to have consequences down the line. But that's sort of how these oral stories have been inserted in. And so I was wondering, like, were there any challenges for you in trying to adapt this very, verbal spoken word medium to the page? How did you decide how to format that, what approach to take?
Yeah. So I think one thing that really, when I was thinking about oral storytelling, because I knew, immediately when I wanted to write this story, I was thinking about oral stories. And I was thinking about the oral storytelling tradition. And I was thinking about a line that I'd heard in my childhood. There was and was not, which is kind of something that you hear around the region. And I was thinking about that line and how it kind of, it has the same, like in the West, a lot of people hear once upon a time. It sort of has this timeless quality to it, and this feeling of, it transports you into another world. There was, but there also wasn't. So you're in this, this middle space where anything is possible. And I knew I wanted to do something like that with The Stardust Thief. And I'd heard, a couple of other variations within the region as well. So the first line that popped into my head when I came up with this story was "neither here nor there, but long ago," which is how all the tales in The Stardust Thief start. And so I started with that line. And then I guess in order to get the voice, a lot of it was memory, was, thinking about the way I had heard tales growing up. I read a lot of oral tales that have been, transcribed and put into books. There's like collections of folk tales from the region that I have. So, I looked very closely at, the way those were formatted, the language that was used in those. And, so it was just kind of a combination of, memory and, I hesitate to call it research so much as just absorption.
Exposure.
Yeah, exactly. So over time, I just became more aware of that style and tried to put that into the stories as I was writing them. It definitely took some editing to get them to have a distinct feeling from the rest of the narrative. But the great thing about The Stardust Thief, I think anyways, is that for me, it has that feeling of kind of an oral story, or at least that's the way I wrote it. Is that it's this sort of whimsical space, neither here nor there. So even though the tales begin that way, that's also kind of, the space that the characters exhibit as well. So even though the tales have their own style, their own voice, I like to think some of that makes it into the narrative as well.
I mean, I certainly a lot of times feel like I'm sitting and listening to it. And I feel like, one thing that we can maybe discuss later is, like audiobooks and how you feel about that. But I imagine that I'm reading it on my phone, but I imagine it would be amazing on audiobook because it does feel like it's being spoken to me in many places.
Well, that makes me happy. I feel like that's exactly what I was going for. And I mean, we could just talk about audiobooks now because one of the most magical experiences for me definitely was the production of the audiobook for The Stardust Thief. Anytime someone brings it up to me, anytime someone says, "Oh, I'm reading the audiobook," I just have to sit down and be like, "Okay, but tell me who do you love most?" And what are you the most excited about? Because I'm so excited about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
so. Are there different voices, or
there are? So for the Stardust Thief, there are 3 different narrators because there are 3 different POV characters. And that has been absolutely incredible. Another thing that we were considering while we were producing the audiobook was bringing in people from the Swana region, which has always really meant a lot to me as a creator, is involving more people from the region. So having narrators from that region was really important to me and really magical. And just being able to hear the Arabic words spoken aloud means a lot to me as well. And just, as we've been saying, there's a special kind of magic to oral storytelling. And so being able to hear my book in that format has been, one of the most exciting things for me. And I have to ask about yours because I have not yet listened to it, but I've heard incredible things and I'm incredibly excited to get into it.
Yeah, so I've listened to the first couple chapters of Kaikei on audiobooks. I haven't listened to the whole thing through, but it's narrated by a South Asian narrator, which was amazing because somebody who also grew up with these stories and already had a relationship to them. Kaikei is told in first person POV through one character's eyes. So there's one narrator, one character, which was exactly what I wanted. But something that I really loved about working with her was that the character starts around age 12, and by the end of the story, she's in her late 30s. And the narrator for the audiobook actually subtly changed her voice and narration style as Kaikei aged, and I just thought that was so cool.
That's amazing.
And also, I was recording, I'm sure you did similar, but all the audio files of all the names and pronunciations, and then to hear those just nailed and feel so natural, it just is so special. So yeah, I love that process. And I think that, at least from what I don't want to reread my book or re-listen to the whole thing, because inevitably I feel like I'm going to start, feeling bad about it.
Nitpicking?
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. But what I did listen to, I was like, wow, this is amazing. It feels like a different book when it's being read to you, I feel like.
I felt the same way. I think listening to the audiobook has been the only time I can experience my story as a reader. Because there's something about, you can be surprised about the cadence and the delivery, exactly. You were saying, having seeing the way the narrators fluctuate their voices and hearing the different voices that they use for the characters. That is something that's always been really incredible to me. Always love hearing, the tonal shifts and little things like that. Also, I mean, just another reminder that oral storytelling is, a totally different kind of storytelling, and it takes a very different kind of skill. I am curious, since we're talking about this right now, if you have any thoughts about what is lost or what is gained when we shift the narrative from, an oral story to something that is, written on page.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier, but when you write something on the page, it's very final. You can reread it and get new meaning for sure, and words can have different layers and hundreds of meaning. But at the end of the day, the words stay the same. And one of the things I love about oral storytelling is that the words don't stay the same, and you as the audience are able to literally interact with and change the course of the story. And so I think that was really hard to translate to the page, because within Kaikai there are moments where stories from Kaikai's world are told. And at first I wanted to sort of just like put some paragraphs of the story, but in several instances I actually ended up making it more of a dialogue. And I thought I was of two minds about it, because I know that sometimes readers don't like stories told in dialogues. It feels very like exposition or like info dumpy, but that's how I heard all my stories, via dialogue. And it allowed Kaikai's character to jump in and ask questions and interact in that way, because a big theme of Kaikai is what do the stories that we're told actually mean? Like, who are they told by? Why does that matter? Like, how does everybody, or the fact that everybody gets a different meaning from the same story and what that means for the course of people's lives. And so allowing Kaikai to have a voice, or other characters even to have a voice in these stories and to jump in with their own questions or interpretation, sort of allowed me to preserve that. Oh my God, we have 13 questions. Okay. I have one fun question for Chelsea, and then we will start going through the questions, I think. So, Chelsea, I promised to ask this, but what Stardust Thief character would win in a dance-off?
Thank you so much for asking me this question. I have always wanted to answer it, even though everyone probably thinks it is very strange.
I want to hear the answer.
So one thing for my conceptualization process, one thing that is actually that helps me figure out the characters is figuring out how they dance together, and which sounds very strange, I'm sure.
You have a dance background?
I don't have a dance background,
okay.
So I don't know why I do this. But there's something about, I think there can be an intimacy to dancing. There's, the expressions that people are making. There's, the joy, the atmosphere. Like, there's so much you can get out of the way a person dance.
So you're like reeling me in real hard right now.
I feel like you might know what I'm talking about even more than what
100%.
I know what I'm talking about. But okay, so if I was taking the four main characters, I've thought about this a lot for some reason. So there are four main characters. There's Mazen, who's a bit of a cowardly prince. There's Luli, the midnight merchant. There's Kadir, who is her Jinn bodyguard, very, very stoic and solemn faced. And then there's Aisha, who is that cutthroat thief. And I have decided, so Kadir is the best dancer, but does not dance. And will not
technically
dance.
Proficient.
Extremely proficient, does not dance, will not dance under any circumstances. So he would automatically be booted out of this contest, or would come in last, because he would simply refuse to participate. Aisha is an excellent swordswoman, is extremely lethal, extremely elegant. So you would think that she would have the ability to move very smoothly when she dances. But I've decided that when it comes to that sort of thing, like, as a character, she's the kind of character who does not like attention, that sort of attention. So she would freeze up or just get really mad at everyone and stomp her way off the dance floor. So of course she would also not win this contest. Luli dances a lot in the Stardust Thief, and very begrudgingly. She never, every time, there are two dance scenes in the Stardust Thief, which is, again, you can tell how much I love dancing. But both times she enters, well, the second one is a little less begrudgingly. But the first time, at least, very begrudgingly, she doesn't like to dance in front of other people unless she is intoxicated. And when she is intoxicated, she's not dancing well. She is dancing with much energy, and without any shame whatsoever. Not a good dancer. So she would probably come in second in this contest. Everyone is always really surprised when I say Mazen is a good dancer, because he's very clumsy throughout the narrative. He's kind of like stumbling his way through the plot. That's the way he exists within the Stardust Thief. And he's also, in certain scenes, he's also very awkward. So people are always really surprised when I say this, but he is a good dancer. So he would win a dance contest. He has only formal training, which, he's a prince. So of course he would have to have some kind of training for that sort of thing. So that is the only reason he would win. So
Look,
that's
I
my
love
answer.
it. I feel like I just learned a ton about the 4 main characters and who they are. So feels like a great relevant question. Okay, so the first question, I see that like people have voted up and down. So we'll go with that. But what's the one thing that changed or evolved from your initial idea or first drafts of Stardust Thief and Kaikei? So I can take this first. One thing that changed a lot for me was the ending of the story, and specifically where the story ends. And the reason it matters so much is because Kaikei's story in the Ramayana basically concludes at what's actually the beginning of the epic. So in that ancient epic, Ram is exiled by his evil stepmother Kaikei, and he goes off on this 14-year journey to save his wife from a demon king, and ultimately, wins and comes home. And I was in the first draft ending the story with that final victory at the end of the Ramayana. And something that has changed to the final draft of Kaikei is that Kaikei sort of now concludes with Kaikei's story. And that's because I was really trying to tell her story and not Ram's, and that's sort of the point of the book. And so sort of forcing her story artificially on to the point of the end of Ram's story didn't make a lot of sense. And so I had to sort of let that ending go. And now the story ends sort of in the middle of where the Ramayana takes place, but it firmly ends Kaikei's story. And so that's something that did change from first draft and when I sold the book to when it was published.
I love how she's become more and more centered throughout the narrative as you've gone through. That's really cool. So for me, am I allowed to say word count? Because I chopped this story down by like 70% from the first draft. It was originally like 297,000 words.
I added 50% of my word count. And I think now our books are the same length.
Two very different processes happening right here. I guess if I had to talk about one thing that evolved the most, I was actually answering a question about this earlier today, and was thinking about this in retrospect. But I'd say character. So Aisha, when I originally wrote her into the Stardust Thief, she was a very minor character. She just and most of the time when I have my characters, I think about them for a very long time. I kind of get a feel for who they are as people. I have an opening scene in mind for them. And then I continue to discover who they are as I start writing. Aisha, I didn't have any of that. She just spontaneously appeared in the narrative. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. She's here now. I wonder if she'll be important later. And in the first draft, she wasn't important for a very long time. But I found myself gravitating to her character more and more. As I went through the process, I suddenly realized, oh, wait, she is really important. And here's why I should bring her into the narrative more. So as I did my revisions, I kept adding more and more and more of her. I'd say in the second draft, I did a major overhaul where like there was a very big plot point that I shifted so that Aisha was a lot more involved in the story. And when I signed with my agent, one of the things she said that really resonated with me was basically add more Aisha. So I added even more Aisha when I signed with my agent. And I think she's just become, a really, really central part of the story. And, to the point where I'm baffled that she was ever minor, because she is just as important as the rest of the main cast at this point.
Aisha's great. So I'm personally very pleased by that. Okay, so with 7 votes, if you woke up in your book's world in the shoes of one of your main characters, which character would you choose and why? I would not want to wake up in the shoes of any of my characters.
I would simply not want to wake up.
I would simply not want to wake up. For context, Kaikei is set in a very patriarchal society, and a lot of the story is, in a patriarchal society, who has the power, what forms of power do women have, and how do their stories intersect? But I would not thrive in that world. I am too angry and too bad at politics to survive as a woman in Kaike's world in the shoes of any of those characters. So as much as I love them all, I would stay asleep.
Yeah,
I'll be Urmila, who is a minor character who sleeps through the entire She is
solid answer
the whole time. That's me. That's who I want.
Seems like the best way to exist within the narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
The safest way.
The safest way for sure.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I have this feeling of like, oh, these characters are doing cool things and I'm really proud of them, but also I feel like I'm too anxious of a human being to be thriving in any of their shoes. Yeah, I would, like, if I had to choose someone from the main cast, I would probably say Luli, just because she's in more of a position of power at the beginning of the story, and like not, like, I mean, I guess all of the characters sort of are in a position of power. Mazen is a literal prince, but he's trapped in the palace and can't leave. So I would rather not. But yeah, probably Luli, because she has the most freedom out of any of the characters.
A lot of agency.
She does. She has a lot of agency up until, she is blackmailed into finding a magic lamp. But even then, she's consistently carving her own path forward anyways. And she collects magic relics. They're like these enchanted magical items within the story that she's known to sell. And that's kind of where she gets her reputation as the Midnight Merchant. So being in that specific kind of position of power, I think would be really fun. I don't think I have the confidence to pull off scamming people like she does, but I like the thought of being able to be in that position.
For sure. I would definitely, if I had to wake up from what I've read in the position of someone in Stardust Thief, but definitely pick Luli. Okay. We've got characters take on new life when readers adopt them. What are some of the best or funniest things people have called your characters or said about them? I'm going to kick this one to you first, Chelsea.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So Mazen, so two things. First of all, whenever people read Mazen, and especially this happened in early reads too, I would get a lot of texts and like live reactions about Mazen's reactions and like his existence within the story. He's been called a wee little lamb, soft prince, cinnamon roll, like all of these things.
So far, he has very Legolas in the Lord of the Rings films energy. Does that make sense? Like especially I'm thinking of like Orlando Bloom's like reactions where he's always just like so shocked at what's happening around.
That's exactly it. Like he's just always like baffled by everything that's going on, and I'm like, but you chose this. Like you did this. You brought yourself on this quest. But yeah, I think that was one of the most exciting things was seeing readers really talk about like protecting Mazen and loving him. And I mean, I have a soft spot in my heart for Mazen, I think, because he's such an empathetic character and he's so soft-hearted. So I think he's a little bit of an untraditional hero. And when I originally wrote him, I was thinking, oh, like, what if people read him and they're just unimpressed? Like, what is this man doing in this story? He has no business being in an epic fantasy. So it was really, really great to hear that feedback. And Kadir, for some reason, has been given like 100 different nicknames. Everyone seems to have different nicknames for him.
I mean, I think it's because he's like a thirst trap, Chelsea. To be quite honest with you.
No comment as the author.
I know. I'm just gonna say it. We're all thinking it.
I mean, if that's the reason, I guess it's not a bad reason, but it's really funny to me. But again, really, really love that. So what about you?
So I think something really, I post these a lot on Instagram. So if like people want to see them, you can find my Instagram. But people have really enjoyed making Gaikai memes. I think because there's like so much, just like so many memeable things happening in the story, especially because it is like an ancient epic. So like there's some like strange things happening, but also I think because there's like such strong sibling dynamics, and that's great meme material. But I like to repost them because they all make me personally laugh out loud. But I think that's been like the funnest or most surprising thing, is like getting tagged in those or getting sent those. And my favorites are always about Kaikei and Yudhajit, who is Kaikei's twin brother, because throughout the story, they both do like really stupid things to each other or like make really stupid decisions, like try to get each other's attention. And like, honestly, I have two younger siblings. To me, it's like very classic, sibling love.
Sibling relationship in a nutshell.
But people always, either they like react really strongly and they're like, I don't get it. Like, what is going on? And I'm like, do you have siblings? They're invariably like, no. And if they do have siblings, they're like, always like, this is so relatable. I can't believe Yudhajit just did blank just to get Kaikei's attention. And I'm like, yep, we've all had those moments with our siblings.
I love the sibling memes.
I know. They're so good, and they're like honestly so real, because like sometimes I feel like you could take out their names and put in like me and my sister or me and my little brother, and like it would be pretty accurate. And I think that's fair for a lot of sibling dynamics. Somebody messaged me on Instagram the other day, and they were like, what Yudhajit just did is exactly what my little brother just did to me 3 days ago. I'm not happy for you, because that's a little alarming, but
I understand.
I feel you. Yeah.
No, and I love the compilations of memes that you post on your Instagram from readers. They're always so much fun to look at.
So it started because my sister liked to make Kaikei memes like before the book came out. So like I posted a couple of sets in like January, February, and I think people saw that and like were inspired, because after that I started like getting memes from readers who are trying to compete with my sister, who is a very good meme maker, but honestly she may have been outclassed by the last set I posted. So
no, like the reader memes are phenomenal. I've gotten tagged in a few too, and like they bring us authors so much joy.
So much. I'm honestly just like shocked that people want to make memes about my book, but yeah, so that's been probably like the most fun reader response I've gotten. Okay, what is the most hilarious moment that you experienced while working on your book?
That one stumps me a bit.
I know. I'm not sure that there were like hilarious moments. There were definitely like typos that made me laugh for 5 minutes straight. So I have a real problem with soldiers and shoulders. Mm-hmm. So I'll be like, the soldiers were marching off to war, but what the sentence actually says is the shoulders were. See, I'm not even doing it right now.
I feel it so much.
There were like a lot of those specific typos in the book, and every time it would not make sense. Like I shrugged my soldiers. Like what does that mean? But those are my own typos that were like making me laugh, which tells you a lot about my sense of humor.
No, I feel that with the typos. I had one typo make it through like 6 or 7 drafts of my story.
Always happens.
And I think it was like chamber was like chapter or something, and someone finally pointed it out to me, and I was like, how did it make it this far? It's not so much a moment, I guess, experienced on my end, but I just find Mazen hilarious to write. I've had moments where I write him and I will laugh out loud just because of the way his narrator is. I've told people this before, but in earlier drafts, Mazen had more of an internal voice because kind of the opposite of Luli, he's very much an overthinker. Mm-hmm. And so, throughout the drafts, it wasn't that he, overthinked things less, but there was less of that dialogue happening on the page. Like no one wants to read someone having a conversation with themselves for like 5 pages. But a lot of that voice made it into his narrative voice. So a lot of his narration is very snarky and self-deprecating. And I think that's because of that internal voice that, kind of fed into the narrative. And so there are moments that I've written him where, I've just laughed out loud and
just imagining you like typing out his chapters, just giggling to yourself.
Yeah. And I mean, like one thing, so I'm a pantser and I'm a, what other people call a discovery writer. I guess I like that term better. But because I'm so surprised by my characters as I write. Like, that's one of the things I love about being a pantser. I think that's how I felt about Mazen. Like, as I was writing him, he would just do all of these delightfully funny things. And like, I hadn't planned for it. It was just, this is the way he's reacting to the situation. So, every time someone asks me, like, do you have a favorite character? I'm like, no, I love them all equally, but I really, really love writing Mazen's chapters for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, he's hilarious. So that checks.
That makes
checks
me
out.
so happy. More comedy relief characters as main characters, please.
please. Okay. Joe asked, is there anything that you had to leave out of the story that you wish you could have kept in? I feel like this is more of a question for Chelsea because, as I mentioned, I added 50% of the word count to this book. So things that were cut were things that really needed to be cut. There was never really a point where I was having to cut stuff for like word count. And so I think there's not really stuff that I can think of that I'm like, oh no, I wish this scene had made it in. But Chelsea, I know you mentioned that tragically darlings had to die.
Yeah, I have an entire document that is just labeled cut but not dead darlings is the way I like to think of it. One thing that really helped me with my edits, because I mentioned before that my first draft was 297,000 words, which is way too long. And I knew that,
I can't imagine the patience it takes to write 297,000 words. And meanwhile, I'm like at like 85,000 words. I'm like, oh my God, I need to be done. I need to be done.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of that when I get to the end of the draft. I'm like, oh my God, it's been 300,000 words. I'm ready to be done with this story. But I think because I like to meander so much in my early drafts and just kind of like feel out the world and the characters. So I don't mind writing those first drafts. It has admittedly been a lot more difficult writing a second book on deadline and like having that same mentality. So that's been fun. So I cut my draft down to I queried at 122,000 words. So I cut 70% of my word count or something over multiple drafts.
That's impressive.
It's impressive and a little frightening. And I'm amazed at myself for doing it, in the midst of me doing it again for the second book, because the second book is also a massive first draft. It's fun in retrospect. I like to talk about it in retrospect, but while I'm in the middle of the process, it's kind of awful. But it's interesting because a lot of people, when I finished this book, a lot of people would suggest, why don't you just make it 3 different books? And I would tell them no, there's literally only enough content in this story for 1 book. That this is just a testament to how much extra content I love to write with the characters. All of that stuff was extremely superfluous. Didn't add much. It certainly added to the characters. And there's a lot of things that I discovered about the characters in those additional words that I cut, but then, was able to include in the story in a meaningful way anyways. There is one character POV that I cut, and it was in one of the later stages of drafting. It was actually after the querying stage. I decided to cut this character, and I love his POV.
Who is it?
His name is Ahmed bin Walid.
Okay.
He's my favorite side character in the story. I don't know if you've met him yet.
I don't think so.
But he's very much a side character now.
Okay.
And I'd say more of a minor character, but originally he had his own chapters. And I'd say his chapters were about 10,000 extra words of content. So I have all of those 10,000 words, still in an earlier draft. And I loved writing him as a character. I thought also his POV chapters, they added something to the story that I don't think ended up feeling right for the draft as it, stands in the end. Because, it was decided that I would take him out because his narrative made the story meander a little bit. And there were a lot of different things and reveals and stuff that came in his chapters that, it was just easier to put them in the main story. So, it's not that I wish I could have kept his chapters in the narrative, because I think the story is better for just having the 3 POVs that it does. But I do love those chapters, so like I would, love to share them as bonus content someday.
For sure. I'd see in the chat. People are really clamoring for the bonus content, so something to consider.
Make a newsletter just for the extra Ahmed content.
So I see 4 votes. Any topics or scenes which were especially hard to write? So this one is sort of an easy answer for me because I think there was one thing in particular that I really struggled with, which was conversations between Kaikai and Ram, who's her stepson that she banishes. In this version of the story, Ram is a much more complicated gray character than in the original Ramayana. And I feel like in the first drafts, I was sort of going between him having lines that were like super evil and super good, and I like couldn't really get to the nuance of that character. And it took a lot of just like practicing and like rewriting. And it was really important to me to nail that part because that's sort of the like crux of the story. Like that, the whole sort of narrative centers around what these conversations are saying and like what the outcome of them is. And I ultimately really wanted Ram's character to seem like, a bit misguided, but very redeemable by the end of the story because he is the hero of the Ramayana, and like that, having that be the ending of the story was important to me. So I struggled with that, not because I was like waffling on what I wanted it to be, but because I just like as a debut author, to be quite honest, like needed to build the technical proficiency to be able to write those scenes. And you get that by repeating and trying and getting feedback from your amazing editor and then doing it again until you nail it. So I think that's like the standout for something that I found difficult. But then by the final, line edit round, I was extremely happy with where it ended up. So it was so worth it to me to rewrite those parts, 4 or 5 times to get it right.
It's as they say, right? Writing is rewriting is rewriting is rewriting. Yeah, no, I absolutely feel the same way. The scene I think that was the hardest for me, that I tweaked the most over multiple drafts, there is a scene between Luli and her bodyguard, Kadir, in which there's a sort of reveal in the story, and it's a moment of high tension between the two of them. That moment was really difficult for me to write because so Luli as a character is very difficult for me to write because she's kind of a storm cloud is what I call her, like an emotional storm cloud. It's hard for me to predict her feelings. She kind of like hides her own emotions even from herself. She's very closed. So that was a moment in the story when I first wrote that scene in the first draft. She had a very visceral, intense response to something that Kadir says to her in that scene. And it took me by surprise. It definitely takes Kadir by surprise in that scene as well. And over the drafts, I kind of had to dig a little deeper into Luli's mind to figure out, what exactly is she feeling? What is her source of anger here? What is the tone of voice she would be using? And so there was a lot of tweaking of dialogue and of just that general exchange between the two of them. Because as I'm sure you know, and all writers know, we have like the scene playing perfectly in our head, but when you try to execute it on the page, it doesn't feel quite right.
It's that horse drawing. With like the very detailed horse, that's like what's in your head, and then you like have like a stick figure. That's how I feel every time I write.
Exactly. I'm like, well, this is fine, right? And then a beta reader, multiple beta readers read this scene and gave me feedback on it, and we're just kind of like, I feel bad for Kadir in this scene. And I was like, okay, fine. I'm gonna go back and revisit and see like, what is going on. So yes, I love Luli so much, but she can be a difficult character to write, emotionally, especially because it's a little harder to get into her head, I think, than some of the others.
For sure. Okay. From Alex Crouch, we have any news for book 2, Chelsea, or your next book, Vaishnavi? So mine is simple. I'm working on another myth retelling. It's a little less of a direct myth retelling in the way Kaikei was, but still very much a myth retelling, set more in the world of the Mahabharata, which is the other Indian epic than the Ramayana. And I think that's kind of all I can say. Hopefully coming to you next year, but we will see where life takes us.
Oh, I'm really, really excited to read this and find out more. Yeah, my book too is also still very much a work in progress. So I, don't have a specific date or time for it, but, hopefully soonish, hopefully next year. Again, we'll see where life takes us.
I feel like that's the best answer I can give to. Are you there, Chelsea?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
I don't know if I went out or you went out, but I think we're both back. Okay, next question. What's the most encouraging thing someone has ever said to you while you were working on your book? And then there's a sub question. Any mean comments that drove you to succeed out of spite?
Oh, man.
I love that question. So, I mean, the most encouraging comments that have, kept me going and publishing and just like wanting to keep pursuing this are from other, South Asian people, especially other young South Asian women who are just like, there's no books like this that we feel reflects us, or even, some of my book is critiquing some of the parts of religion that are hard or like difficult to reconcile. And so like just getting comments that were really excited about seeing that and seeing that reflected on the page really kept me going. I don't really feel like I've gotten like mean comments about my publishing career. Like people are certainly angry about Kaikei. There's definitely that camp because it is a religious story. And while it is my religion, some people aren't happy with how I portrayed it. But I don't think that's been very like post Kaikei coming out and has not made me want to do anything out of spite, because honestly, I feel like it's an open area of religious debate and I'm not angry that people have strong feelings about it. In a way, it makes me feel like I did my job as an author if it's sparking strong feelings about some of these issues. So I don't think I usually, like in my legal, like law school career, I am very much motivated by spite. So I wouldn't say that I'm never motivated like that, but in publishing, not so much.
Yeah, I think similar answer. Other things I'm definitely motivated by spite. Not so much with the Stardust Thief, although there was not a comment and, not mean, but thinking about like, motivations, thinking about like the depictions of Arab coded characters that I saw, many of which were, especially like within fantasy, kind of offensive or stereotypical. Again, like that wasn't targeted specifically at me, but sometimes as a kid, it kind of felt like it was. It's because I was looking for that kind of representation in books, and then, just it was inauthentic and sometimes, very wrong in offensive ways that could do harm. And so, while I definitely wrote The Stardust Thief for myself and as a love letter to oral storytelling and to, my heritage, that was definitely something that was cycling through my mind as I wrote it, was, I want to write something that feels authentic and something that does, that depicts, this region, or like, a story that is inspired by this region in a favorable and nuanced and real way. And in terms of nice comments, yeah, I mean, I feel like I got really lucky with my beta readers. I had some really lovely people, read early drafts of this story, and, got very nice comments throughout. And, that's not to say I didn't get really good constructive feedback. But my, all of my critique partners and beta readers were great, because every time they gave me that feedback, they made sure it was, in a compliment sandwich, so that I could take it without feeling like, everything that I was writing was awful.
For sure.
I think I think the most exciting thing, or some of the most motivating things, is whenever I get live reactions from people. That always makes me really happy as a writer. I actually got through my first draft because I was trading off pages with someone. And we were not allowed to say anything bad about each other's stories during a first draft because, first drafts are awful. And you just want to motivate someone to keep writing. So that has always been really motivational, inspirational to me, to see someone experiencing the story in real time, and getting those reactions from them. And I've gotten them from beta readers. I've had, readers leave little comments here and there. And they always just, extremely motivating, and always just really lovely to receive as an author.
For sure. Okay, so we have 10 minutes and 10 questions. So I think it's speed round time.
All right.
If your book was adapted into a video game, what genre would it be, or what gameplay dynamics would it have? I watch a lot of video games. I watch my fiance play video games all the time. I myself do not play video games, so I know nothing about like styles, gameplay, whatever. I am very bad at them, so I'm not really sure. Over to you, Chelsea.
I am a gamer, and while I would love for this to be an RPG like game, I think it would be like the world would be suited for a role play game. It definitely has the lore and the banter and the dialogue between the characters. But I can't help but wonder if a platformer might be better, because these characters are going through all this like rough terrain and these ruins and whatnot, and every time I think about like battle systems in video games, only 2 of the main cast are technically like competent warriors. Like Mazen would not, Mazen would flee every single battle in a video game. So I wonder if having the characters like hop over obstacles and make their way through the landscape like that might be better suited for a video game format.
For sure. Okay. Why did you choose this type of plot and these themes to explain your book? What about these types of stories interests you? Okay, so the 60-second version I'm going to attempt is that this is a story about a woman who has been very maligned in this myth, and this myth is very foundational to a culture and to a religion. And so the way that we treat women in these myths really, to me, matters and is indicative of some broader questions of how we treat women. And so to me, exploring these themes of patriarchy and agency and free will and who controls stories was just extremely important. And I didn't consciously set out to explore this theme. I was just trying to write a story, but I think writing the story of a maligned woman in a myth that's so relevant today necessarily caused me to implicate all of these themes.
Yeah, so I think for me, this particular story, I just knew that I wanted to do something that, like I've said before, was a love letter to oral storytelling, and also specifically to, my Arab heritage and to the culture that I had grown up with. And, again, to do it in sort of an authentic and, what I hope is an authentic and more realistic or more nuanced way. And, as a writer, I'm just really interested in storytelling, and the different like formats, the different ways we experience stories. I think so often like people talk about not being readers and like not wanting to experience stories that way. And I always respond like, well, you're watching TV. You're, every single day you talk to someone, you are telling a story of what happened that day. So I just really like to take some time to reflect on that in my writing in some way. And the Stardust Thief specifically is, while talking about oral storytelling, is talking about that blurred line between fiction and reality. And I hope that the story kind of gives readers, or, will inspire readers to reflect on more of those lines within their own lives, and how we see those blurred lines even within our own traditions and within our own histories. And just, what kind of impact that has on our cultures, but also on other cultures as well.
Yeah. Okay. Did you mesh a lot of the oral stories together for your book, or did you really focus it down to one or a few for the inspiration? So the Ramayana was originally told via oral tradition. I mean, it was written down also millennia ago, like 3,000 years ago, but it continues to be told as an oral tradition. So that was sort of like one huge oral story that's, broken up and told in parts, but that's sort of served as the backbone for this story. And then within it, I also have a couple of other stories that I picked in particular for showing some of the themes or history of the world. But the main story is not really a mashup so much as just one extremely, extremely long oral story.
And I feel like my answer is quite the opposite, because mine is very much a mashup of oral stories and inspirations from those oral stories. The Stardust Thief takes, kind of like little concepts and nuggets of those stories, and then repurposes them or refashions them into something new, I think. So what I hope readers glean, I hope there's that familiarity of, oh, I recognize that story. But then that surprise of, oh, wait, this is not the story as I experienced it. This is something quite different. So I kind of tried to straddle the line between the two in The Stardust Thief.
I love that. All right, this question is for Chelsea. While The Stardust Thief is a fantasy, there's a large element of mystery also involved in the story. How much fun did you have spreading breadcrumbs throughout the book?
I feel like that depends on the draft. Because in the early draft, the early draft was very much a mystery to me as well, because I, discover the plot as I go along. And so like I'm figuring out things with the characters and it's really exciting. Sometimes very frustrating, but mostly really exciting because, I'm discovering, all these reveals and secrets with the characters. But then when I edit, I'm trying to figure out how to paste those reveals. If there are any info dumps, I'm trying to get rid of that and figure out other places in the story where this information can pop up. And I think it's like a really good puzzle. Like there's, it's a pleasure to work on the puzzle. Like it's fun. But it also is really difficult, and like sometimes you get really frustrated when the two pieces don't work together. Or you can't find that one single piece missing in the corner. So I think it was a little bit of both. I think the further on I got in the drafts, the more I enjoyed doing it because everything just kind of fell into place. So I was working with less and less puzzle pieces.
How did you come up with the new characters' names? Or for you, probably all the characters' names. So most of my characters are from the Ramayana, so their names already existed. But I had a lot of fun picking the names that were not from the story because I got to make like little references or use like Sanskrit roots to make their names. So, for example, one of my favorites is Ashwin, who is one of Kaikeyi's younger brothers, who is unnamed in the epic. Only Kaikeyi and her twin brother are named in the epic. But he early on decides on a path that's going to lead him to become a healer and a physician. And so I named him after Ashwin, who is the healer of the gods or the physician of the gods in Hindu mythology. So I got to like insert little references like that, which was a lot of fun.
That's really cool. I'm very much I need to have the characters' names before I can write them, because they kind of grow into their names. And so for me, a lot of my names start with meaning. Like for instance, Luli, who also goes by Layla, that name is related to night. And so like if you look up most of these names online, you'll be able to find these different meanings, which I hope once you get through the story, make a little more sense for some of the characters.
For sure. That's so interesting that you can't write without the names, because sometimes I just put in XYZ for names if I can't think of them.
I can't, yeah.
So interesting to see the reverse process. Okay, if you had to throw in a character and a villain that you love from any media into your book, who'd you bring in to make a chaotic crossover? Oh my God.
I'm so bad at these questions.
I know.
On the
Okay,
spot.
this is like a bit of a cheat because it's a character from the Ramayana who didn't make it in. But if I could bring in one more character from the Ramayana that's not in this story, I would bring in Hanuman, who is the, very powerful monkey god who is Ram's ally in the Ramayana. And he's such a fun character. He's so cool. He can like literally carry mountains and like leap across oceans. And there was just not room to fit him into this book because I had already tried to cram in every Ramayana character I possibly could. And at some point, it just wasn't going to work with the story. But if I could throw him in, I'm sure, Kaikeyi, you would have loved to meet him.
I honestly do not have an answer for this question. I feel so bad. But I feel like under pressure, I don't have anyone that comes to mind immediately.
That's okay. We can jump to the next one, which we kind of answered a little bit, but which character was the most fun to write? So I loved writing Yudhajit, who is Kaikeyi's twin brother, because I love writing Kaikeyi and it's all from her perspective, but every time I got to give Yudhajit the line of dialogue, I was like, what's the most chaotic thing a man could say right now? And that was just a lot of fun. And especially to write his dynamic with Kaikeyi, both in the ups and the downs, was just so rewarding and cathartic at the end. So yeah, I really loved writing him.
I think for me, I love writing all of my characters, really, truly. One of the reasons I'm a multi POV person is because I love jumping into different characters' heads. Every time I tell myself I'm going to just do one POV, the second chapter comes around and I fail to uphold that. But I do think that Mazen is my favorite to write, just because, I mentioned before, his narrative voice is he's not snarky, but his narrator tends to be kind of snarky and a little self-deprecating. And I think that's part of the humor that he brings to the story, is that narrative voice kind of collides a little with the things that he's saying. So I just really love writing the mixture of those two things for him.
I love that. Okay, I think we've got one last question, which is to wrap up, what's something you read, watched, or listened to lately that you loved? So I am currently halfway through The Stardust Thief by Chelsea, and I am loving it. I promise we didn't plan this. I just am naturally in the middle of this book. And it's wonderful. So if this conversation hasn't sold you yet, this is my personal endorsement of this book. I'm also halfway through right now Our Flag Means Death, which is the gay pirate TV show. And
it's
I'm also
so good.
really enjoying that, but don't spoil it for me because I'm literally only 4 or 5 episodes in, because I was waiting to be done with finals. So yeah, that's sort of where I'm at right now.
So TV show wise, I am currently finally watching Ted Lasso. Everyone's been talking about it forever. I just recently finished Our Flag Means Death. Really, really loved it. Have a lot of feelings about the ending. So do share when you're done.
I'll text you as soon as I'm done.
Yes, please do. But so watching Ted Lasso right now, really, really enjoying it. I'm surprised by how wholesome it is. So, just very feel good vibes. Reading, I am in between 2 ARCs right now. The first Binding, which is like a brick.
Oh my god, I want to read that.
It's really, it's really stunning. By R.R. Verdi, coming out this fall. I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but also about storytelling. Really phenomenal. Really enjoying it. And then I'm also reading another Orbit book, The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy.
How do you get these? I really want to read that book. I love rom-coms so much.
It's so good.
I'm always reading at least one romance at any given time.
I highly recommend this one.
Okay, they just said we'll get you a copy. Thank God.
Megan's writing is really great. Her banter is fantastic. And so this is very much a rom-com fantasy, so it's got fantasy elements in it as well.
I need
you gotta get yourself a copy.
I've watched Bridgerton season 2 like 7 times. Like I need another romance. I know
you
I'm just
really
bad
like
at
this one.
asking. I just like then get jealous when I see other people have a book that I want. Thanks, Priyanka.
All right. Well,
I'm just being roasted in the comments now.
Now you know to ask going forward.
I know. Well, see, the thing is, I feel bad about asking because, like, what if I don't read it in time? But then I like get jealous when somebody else has it. So I'm just the worst of all worlds. Okay. On that note, folks, thank you so much for tuning in. This was a blast, and your questions were great and so much fun to answer. But yeah, check out Chelsea's book, The Stardust Thief. It just came out a few days ago, and there's a green button that you can use to buy it.
Oh my God. And also check out my conversation partners as well. Phenomenal retelling.
So after our 30-second attempt at self-promo, I think that's all from us tonight. But thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Bye, y'all.